Picture two families. They live about 10 days walk apart, close enough that one stubborn person could cover the distance in under 2 weeks. And for 50,000 years, they never meet. Not once. They share a species, they share a way of life, they live and die without ever knowing the other group is out there. That isn't a guess, that's what the DNA says. For most of your life, you've probably been handed a simple story about Neanderthals. They were the slow ones, the brutes, the cavemen who lost. Smarter humans walked into Europe, the dim cousins got shoved off the edge of the world, and that was that. The real story is stranger, and honestly, it's sadder. The last Neanderthals weren't stupid, and they weren't unusually violent, and there was never one big war that finished them. What happened to them was quieter than that, and it started a very long time before we ever showed up. So let's throw out the cartoon and look at what the bones and the genes actually say. Because the closer you get to how the last of them lived, the more uncomfortable this gets. Start with the violence, since that's where the myth is loudest. For decades, the headline fact about Neanderthals was their injuries. Roughly 30% of the fractures we found on them are to the head and neck. That's a staggering number. It's higher than almost any modern cause of injury you can name. So researchers went looking for a living group that breaks the same way. And they found one. Rodeo riders. People who get thrown by animals several times their own weight. The picture basically wrote itself. Neanderthals hunted huge Ice Age animals up close, stabbing them with heavy spears, and they paid for it with their faces. A whole shelf of documentaries ran with that. Brutal lives, bodies built for pain. Then a team went back and actually checked it. In 2018, instead of leaning on a handful of famous skeletons, they built a big database. A head injury leaves an obvious mark, so it gets noticed. A cracked rib or a healed ankle quietly doesn't. Once they corrected for that, the legend cracked. Neanderthal head trauma came out about the same as the modern humans living right alongside them. They weren't getting battered worse than everyone else. They were getting hurt about as often as the people we like to call the winners. So if the worst part of being a Neanderthal wasn't the violence, then what was it? To feel the answer, you need to meet one of them. In a cave in northern Iraq, up in the Zagros Mountains, archaeologists found a man we now call Shanidar I. He lived around 50,000 years ago. His is one of the most studied skeletons on Earth because just about everything that could go wrong with a body had gone wrong with his. He was blind in one eye, probably from a crushing blow to the side of his face he took as a young man. That same injury seems to have withered his right arm, which was either lost on its own or amputated at the elbow. He walked with a heavy limp from old damage to his leg and foot, and bony growths deep in his ear canals mean he was very likely deaf, or close to it. Now hold that picture. One eye, one working arm, a ruined leg, little or no hearing, and he's living through the Ice Age, surrounded by cave hyenas and big cats, in a world where you stay alive by chasing fast animals and dodging faster ones. A man like that shouldn't survive a single winter. He should be the first one something takes in the dark. He lived into his 40s. Sit with what that takes. Somebody brought him food he couldn't catch. Somebody watched the dark for a man who couldn't hear what was creeping up behind him. For years, his group spent real energy keeping alive a person who, by the brutal math of survival, gave very little back. Eric Trinkhaus, the anthropologist who spent a career on these bones, describes something that looks nothing like a pack of animals. It looks like long, deliberate care. And this is where the story turns. Because that exact tenderness, that refusal to let their broken people die, points straight at the thing that was quietly killing them. To see the problem, walk into another cave. This one's in northern Spain, a site called El Cidrón. It holds the remains of a single Neanderthal group, about 13 of them. Men, women, teenagers, small kids. A family caught at one terrible moment around 49,000 years ago. The first thing the bones tell you is who these people were to each other. 3 of the adult men were closely related. The whole group was bound together by blood. And when researchers looked closer, they found a detail that changes everything. Half-siblings had been having children together, not out of some broken sense of right and wrong, out of having no choice. There just wasn't anybody else around to start a family with. You can read the cost of that straight off their skeletons. Across this one small group, scientists counted 17 separate congenital deformities, things you're born with. A cleft in the top bone of the neck, turning up over and over. extra bones, missing bones, malformed feet. The El Cedrón team didn't soften it. A Neanderthal family this inbred, this late in the game, might be the opening scene of the collapse. Think about the trap they were in. The same closeness that made them care for a blind, one-armed man was also shrinking their gene pool with every birth. To survive day to day, you need a tight, loyal group. To stay healthy across generations, you need to keep mixing with strangers. The last Neanderthals were getting the first and losing the second, and those two needs were quietly pulling them apart. And these weren't careless people fumbling through life. In the hardened tartar still stuck to the El Cedrón teeth, chemists found traces of yarrow and chamomile, bitter plants with almost no food value. The likeliest reason a person chews something bitter and useless is that it does something to the body. They may have been treating themselves, medicating. A family that knew plants well enough to dose itself was also, at the very same time, slowly running its own bloodline into the ground. Both of those are true at once. That's what makes it so hard to look away from. Now take that one inbred family and pull back, because the genuinely unsettling part is how normal their isolation turns out to be. Which brings us back to those two families 10 days apart, and to a man researchers nicknamed Thorin. Thorin was found at a rock shelter in southern France called Grotte Mondra, and his skeleton is still being lifted out of the ground, one tooth at a time, after years of work. In 2024, a team finally sequenced his full genome. The result stopped them cold. Thorin's line had split off from every other late Neanderthal around 105,000 years ago. Let that land. His people had been drifting on their own for so long that geneticists called them a ghost lineage, a branch of Neanderthals nobody knew had ever existed. And his own genome carried the same fingerprint of inbreeding written into that family back in Spain. But the detail that made headlines was about his neighbors. Another Neanderthal group lived close by, close enough that you could walk between them in about 10 days. And the genes are clear. Thorin's people and that other group never mixed. For something like 50,000 years, two populations of the same species sat almost within reach of each other and stayed total strangers. One of the lead researchers, Ludovic Slimak, put it in a way that sticks. For our species, ignoring a group of people a week and a half away for 50,000 years would be unthinkable. We'd have traded, or fought, or married in, or at least talked. Neanderthals apparently didn't. Each little band stayed its own closed circle. So picture the real map of the last Neanderthals. Not one people spread across a continent, a scatter of tiny, sealed-off pockets. Each one small, each one inbreeding, each one unaware of, or just indifferent to, the others who could have saved its bloodline. That's a species already in deep trouble. And we haven't even reached the part everyone blames yet. Here's the question that should be nagging at you by now. If they were this fragmented, this thinned out, this genetically cornered, how long had it been going on? When did the decline actually start? The answer is the most disorienting fact in the whole story. It started before we arrived, long before. Go back about 110,000 years, tens of thousands of years before any modern human walked into Europe in real numbers. Scientists found a way to measure how varied Neanderthals were as a group, using a part of the body you'd never think to check: the inner ear. Deep in your skull sit 3 tiny looping canals that keep your balance, and their exact shape is a little different from person to person. The more variety in those shapes across a group, the healthier and more diverse that group is. When researchers measured those canals in Neanderthal fossils across time, they watched the variety shrink. Around 110,000 years ago, the range of shapes narrowed, and then it stayed narrow. That's the signature of a bottleneck, a moment when a population crashes down to a small number of survivors, and everyone who comes after is descended from that thin remainder. So the Neanderthals were already living on a reduced deck of cards, and they'd been living that way for a very long time. Then it happened again. A recent study found that around 65,000 years ago, the Neanderthals of Europe went through another upheaval, and nearly all their genetic lines vanished. One lineage survived and spread back across the continent. Almost every late Neanderthal we know of traces back to that single surviving thread. Now, line up the dates, because this is where the whole story rearranges itself. The bottleneck at 110,000 years, the near wipeout at 65,000, and modern humans only push into Europe in force around 45,000 years ago. By the time we show up, the supposed villains of this story have already been shrinking and inbreeding and bleeding diversity for the better part of 70,000 years. We didn't walk in and break a thriving people. We walked in near the end of a decline that had been grinding on since before our ancestors even left Africa. Then, roughly 39,000 years ago, a volcano near modern Naples erupted with a violence that's hard to picture. It threw out around 200 cubic kilometers of magma and buried much of southern and eastern Europe under ash. We call it the Campanian ignimbrite. The sky would have gone dark. The cold would have bitten deeper. It's tempting to pin it all on the volcano, but the honest answer is harder than that. The eruption hammered early modern humans too. It wasn't a weapon aimed at Neanderthals. It was just one more shock landing on a population that no longer had the numbers to absorb a shock. A big, healthy species rides out a terrible century. A handful of inbred bands doesn't. Which finally brings us to the question hiding under this entire video. If there was no war, no single massacre, no clean moment of defeat, then how does a whole kind of human actually disappear? Researchers built a model of what happens when a small number of modern humans keep trickling into Neanderthal territory, generation after generation. And the two groups have children together. No violence, nobody getting outsmarted, just a steady, gentle inflow from a much larger population. Run that forward, and over 10 to 30,000 years, the Neanderthals are simply absorbed, diluted. Their distinct line disappears into the bigger pool, not because they lost, because there were always more of us and we kept blending in. The newest thinking adds the last piece, and it loops right back to where we started: loneliness. The Neanderthals, those sealed-off pockets who ignored their own kind 10 days away, had no web like that. Every isolated group was on its own, and a group on its own, when the cold comes or the children stop arriving, just quietly goes out. That's what "had it worse than you think" really means. Not a dramatic last stand, a slow fade, in the dark, alone, with the odds stacked from the inside long before the end ever came. But there's one last turn, and it changes how you walk away from all of this. They didn't entirely die. Read the genome of almost anyone alive today with roots in Europe or Asia, and between 1 and 2% of it is Neanderthal. The pieces that helped with cold, with fighting off disease, with skin, got folded into us and carried forward. Some scientists argue it isn't even accurate to call it extinction, because they were absorbed into our gene pool instead of erased from it. So the last Neanderthals lost their world. They lost their bloodlines and their separate way of seeing everything. But a thread of them slipped across the line and kept going, riding inside the very people who were supposed to have replaced them. Which means the strangest part of their story isn't in a cave in France or a mountain in Iraq. It's a lot closer than that. If your roots run through Europe or Asia, a small, stubborn piece of the last Neanderthals made it out. It's still here. It's in you.